I'm Jack Mandeville, and this is Jacked History. Every respective major American sport has had its share of outliers, those who buck the perceived norms of how an athlete should conduct themselves and forge their own paths while backing up their conduct with a high level of play in the arena. Golf, a gentleman's game, gave us the backwoods, beer drinking, cigarette smoking, mullet-clad John Daly, who hit a golf ball like no other. In an era of basketball that saw clean-cut, media-savvy stars who were primed to endorse all-American products, Dennis Rodman emerged as a true maverick of the game, dyeing his hair and getting piercings, wearing dresses, and partying all hours of the night while still operating on the court at a Hall of Fame level. Baseball has had no shortage of unique personalities, but look no further than episode 10 of Jack History about Mo Burke. Go ahead and watch it. I don't know why, but this episode bombed and it deserves more views. Seriously, it's such a good story. Do I sound desperate, Peter? And last, there's American football, with personalities like CTE-ridden Antonio Brown, whose Cracker of the Day series on X has quickly become one of my favorite things about that hell app. But what about boxing? Surely the oldest sport in the world has had some true renegades in its ranks. But of all the big names who have come through the sport, we're focusing this episode on the king of not giving a shit, Jack Johnson. Born in Galveston, Texas in 1878, Johnson's parents, like many black Americans during that time, were former slaves who had lived the first parts of their lives in bondage and were now struggling to make ends meet as free people.
I was born a poor black child.
It would be safe to assume that Johnson's childhood in the Jim Crow South was rife with injustice and racism, but you'd be surprised. Galveston was a bit of an anomaly in the South, a secluded coastal town that was often cut off from the social and political norms of its neighboring communities. Its white and black citizens were so universally impoverished that Johnson was admittedly not affected by segregation like many other black Americans of the day.
But we raised you like you were one of us.
You mean I'm gonna stay this color?
He openly socialized with white children and was welcomed into their homes as if Jim Crow was non-existent. This is a direct quote from him. "No one ever taught me that white men were superior to me." This upbringing would shape how he would approach life in his adult years. And like many children of the day, Johnson decided school wasn't for him. He worked dock jobs around Galveston until he found himself working with horses in Dallas. That's where he got his first taste of boxing, watching his boss and his friends spar in their spare time. After a brief stint in New York City at the age of 16,
New York City!
Johnson was back in Galveston and had saved enough money to buy his first pair of boxing gloves. He spent a few years fighting in underground matches around Texas before his professional debut at age 19 in 1898, where he knocked out his opponent in the second round.
The price is wrong, bitch.
All right, so one thing you gotta understand during the early days of his professional boxing career was that on paper he was mainly fighting black fighters as he approached the 10-win record because sanctioned prize fighting was still generally segregated. But in that time, he was taking unsanctioned fights against anybody he could, including dozens of underground matches with white fighters. One of those fights was against Joe Choinski, I don't know, one of the Polak names, in which Choinski knocked out Johnson in the third round. As if losing wasn't bad enough for Johnson, he and Choinski were both jailed as prize fighting was still illegal in the state of Texas. Because their bail was set so high, the two spent 23 days in jail together, only being released when the sheriff agreed to release them if they put on a match in their cell, which they did. A fight that would draw local crowds to watch the jail match and would form a lifelong friendship with Choinski, who would go on to be Johnson's trainer and mentor. In 1901, Jack Johnson won the World Colored Heavyweight Championship, making him the best black heavyweight in the world, a title he defended 12 times throughout the early 1900s. But Johnson didn't want to be just the best black fighter in the world. No, Johnson wanted it all. He wanted the opportunity to fight some whites. And right around that time he was getting the opportunity to fight the whites, Johnson was also publicly wanting to love the whites too. Oh yeah, old Jack Johnson was beginning his public foray into banging white women.
Hey, where are the white women at?
Because Jack Johnson didn't give a shit about fucking nothing. Two things happened for him in 1907. He got to fight a white guy. and he got to love a white lady. Johnson's petitioning to fight a white boxer on record was granted in July of 1907, when he fought and clobbered former heavyweight champion Bob Fitzsimmons, but not before current heavyweight champion James Jeffries retired on the basis he wouldn't fight a black man. Also in that time, Johnson had a much public affair with an Australian white woman named Lola Toy.
Let's put another shrimp on the barbie.
In which he went on the record saying he intended to marry Toy. You can only imagine how the press handled that. And he didn't just have a one-off encounter with a white woman, he flat out told the press he would only be with white women going forward. And boy, was he not lying. Just a year later, in 1908, after years of taunting him in the press, Johnson beat white Canadian heavyweight champion Tommy Burns in 14 rounds, a fight that was stopped by the police. Jack Johnson was now the heavyweight champion of the world.
Yo, Adrian! I did it!
And of course, white America embraced Jack Johnson with open arms, right? Fuck no. A black champion boxer of the world was not a good look for white folks in 1908. Following matches against Johnson had each white fighter billed as the Great White Hope, in anticipation of them beating Johnson, which they couldn't do.
I never let a white boy beat me.
It was in 1910 that former heavyweight champion James Jeffries came out of retirement to challenge the incumbent in what was billed as the fight of the century. Both men were looking to get a multi-million-dollar payout adjusted to today's money, and the fate of racial pride was on the line depending on who won that fight. Many in the boxing press didn't see Johnson's world champion title as valid, since the reigning champion, Jeffries, retired before they could fight years prior. So now with these two matching up, there would be no question who the true champion was. This was the biggest fight the world had ever seen up to that point.
Hi everyone, this is an ad read. All right, today we're gonna be cooking with Grill Your Ass Off seasoning. I love Grill Your Ass Off. I've known the owner for years. They are my first sponsor. You can use Grill Your Ass Off for anything. Pork, chicken, beef, but today we're gonna be using it for one of my most favorite dishes in the world that I've been making for years. Cereal.
Whoa, Jack Johnson. Whoa, Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson had a wife. That damn bitch was white. Bam-a-lam.
My mouth was so freaking horny earlier. Oh, but it just got fulfilled. Trust me, it just got fulfilled. I'm Jack Mandeville. I'm 26 years old. I'm from Portugal. This is a Portuguese accent, and you just got contented.
The Great Black Hope versus the Great White Hope. Everyone in America and other parts of the world were paying attention. On July 4th, 1910, in front of a 20,000 person sold out crowd in Reno, Nevada, Jack Johnson proceeded to beat the ever-loving shit out of James Jeffries for 15 rounds until Jeffries' corner threw in the towel to prevent him from being knocked out. Johnson was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. It's safe to say that America took it well, right? Fuck no! People lost their shit. Race riots occurred in over 25 cities in the United States.
Can we all get along? Can we get along?
And it wasn't just the white folks who were instigating it. Black people were too. Everybody was losing their goddamn minds because of that fight. It was so bad that 20 people ended up dying as a result. But even boxing greats like John L. Sullivan acknowledged that Johnson was the most superior fighter in the world. And regardless of a lot of white anger, a lot of white folks were starting to warm up to Johnson. The Johnson-Jeffries fight movie became the highest grossing film of all time up until that point, despite many cities banning the film from being shown at movie theaters. Now, you would think that Johnson's victory would have opened the doors for other black fighters to enter into desegregated matches, right? Fuck no. The color barrier for black fighters continued despite Johnson being the reigning world champion. But not for the reasons you'd think. It had less to do with the white establishment not letting black fighters take a crack at Johnson, and more to do with Johnson purposefully not fighting black fighters. For years, as Johnson defended his heavyweight title, he continually ducked prominent black heavyweights because he admittedly thought there was more money in fighting white boxers. So with Johnson, a black man, as the new face of international boxing, you would think Black America would have embraced him, right? Fuck No! His refusal to fight and elevate other black boxers, along with his increasingly open love of white women, brought scorn from the black community and prominent black leaders like Booker T. Washington. Now, the white and black folk were pissed off at him. But Jack Johnson didn't give a damn. Because if there's one thing you should have learned about him at this point, was that Jack Johnson did what Jack Johnson wanted to do.
Honey Badger don't give a shit, it just takes what it wants.
A true American figure who marched to the beat of his own drum, despite how dangerous it was for him at that time in America. It was in this time he married Etta Deria. The marriage was toxic from the start. Between Johnson's constant infidelity and his tendency to smack her around, Etta, who was already prone to depression, finally cracked and died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound in 1912.
Hey, my girlfriend's dead, you know. She fell off a cliff and died on impact.
It was only a few months after Etta's death that Jack Johnson was remarried to another white woman, an 18-year-old prostitute named Lucille Cameron.
Sold! To the big black guy, right there.
Whom Johnson started courting while Etta was still alive. That marriage would last 12 years until she filed for divorce in 1924 due to, well, you guessed it, infidelity. It was his marriage to Lucille that brought attention from the feds when he was accused of violating the Mann Act, which basically meant he was accused of transporting a woman across state lines due to immoral purposes. You know, for being an alleged prostitute and all. And it should go without saying, a lot of this negative attention was because he was in an interracial marriage, which, you know, wasn't the most popular thing at that time. Even though he beat the charges against him with Lucille, it was another former white prostitute that came forward from a relationship years prior that got Jack Johnson convicted and sentenced to a year in prison in 1913.
Don't ever marry a white woman, Cortez.
In the middle of his reign as heavyweight champion. He and Lucille then skipped bail and lived in exile all over Europe, South America, Canada, and Mexico from 1913 to 1920. Shortly after his exile, Johnson finally agreed to fight a black contender for the championship title. And though there were no shortages of accomplished black boxers during that time who could have easily given him a decent run for his money, Johnson opted to fight a relatively unknown boxer with an unimpressive record named Battling Jim Johnson, also from Galveston, Texas. Johnson versus Johnson would be the first time two black men competed for the heavyweight title. The fight, held in Paris, France, was a draw. But because it was a draw, Jack got to hold on to his title. It was in 1915 that the boxing gods finally caught up to Johnson, when he lost his championship title to journeyman fighter and unlikely Great White Hope candidate Jess Willard during the 26th round of their sold-out fight in Havana, Cuba. So a lot of people in the press speculated that Johnson took a dive to a white man because he wanted his Mann Act conviction dropped, but there's little proof of that. Jack Johnson continued his rise in popularity despite the loss of his belt, and won fights all over the world until he returned to the United States and surrendered himself in 1920 after 7 years on the lam. After serving his prison sentence at Leavenworth Penitentiary, Johnson continued to take exhibition fights for the next 20 years, well into his 60s. In 1924, after his divorce from white woman number 2, Johnson married white woman number 3, Irene Pino, a marriage that lasted until his death. Good for him. In the height of his boxing career, and even into the twilight years of his career, Johnson wasn't just a fighter. He accumulated a tremendous amount of wealth, and much of it was invested in his second athletic love, race car driving. Not only that, he cut musical records, owned popular nightclubs all over the United States, and even got a patent on an improved monkey wrench. In 1945, at the age of 68, just a year after he took his last professional fight, Johnson was driving with a friend from Galveston to New York City. They decided to stop into a segregated diner in Franklinton, North Carolina, where they were both refused service.
You can't sit with us!
An angry Johnson got back in his car and drove off at a high rate of speed, when he eventually collided into a telegraph pole. He died later that evening. He died going fast, just as he lived his life. In many ways, Johnson has become a cultural icon 80 years after his death. As we've seen in this, he lived a pretty controversial life during his time. But years later, he's kind of become this heroic American figure. And in 2018, then American President Donald Trump, current American President Donald Trump. Wait, that was his first administration, so it would mean he was then American President. Whatever. President Donald Trump granted Jack Johnson a full pardon for his Mann Act conviction 105 years earlier. Jack Johnson, American Titan, renegade athlete, businessman, race car driver, musician, and legendary lover of white bitches.
And I need you. And I miss you.
Please, I'm begging you, like, subscribe, and share on social media, or I'm going to leave a tip on the FBI hotline that Peter is violating the Mann Act.
Round one, round two, Jack Johnson packs a punch. He'll knock out the blacks and the whites and give them their last rites. Round three, round four, now he's got himself a wife, a woman of the night, lighter than Snow White. Jack Johnson loves white women, he loves them so very much. They are a sight to see. Please share Jacked history. Jack history.
I don't know why I start coughing whenever I'm reading. Oh yeah, 25 years of cigarettes.